We all love tasting a new batch of our favourite coffee from our favourite origin, or indeed trying a new coffee from an otherwise unknown origin to us. Certainly where I'm from in Sydney, the industry depends very heavily on place-based marketing. The heavy body of a Sumatra Mandailing, or the bright acidity of a Guatemalan Antigua. You could say that geography is at the very essence of today's specialty coffee sector. Yet I don't think we give it as much attention as it deserves. So today I'd like to try to make the argument that geography is likely to become an increasingly contested moral and political arena in the industry in the years ahead. Now, in their book, The Coffee Paradox, Benoit de Viron and Stefano Ponti identify a paradox in the industry, whereby a coffee crisis in producing countries was occurring alongside a boom in coffee-consuming countries. Now, they identified the cause of this paradox as the fact that producers were selling coffee based on its material attributes, what the coffee looked like, the defect count, and sometimes how it tasted. Whereas coffee was then sold in consuming countries based primarily on its symbolic attributes, brand names, trademarks, or indeed origin stories. And it's that paradox which many producers now are trying to overcome by gaining a greater share of the symbolic quality attributes of their coffee. So what do the wine-growing regions of France have to do with coffee geography? Well, the system of intellectual property protection emerged in France in the 1930s, whereby certain coffee regions, such as Champagne, were protected as a form of IP. You have to be living in the region of Champagne to be able to label your sparkling wine using that name Champagne. It's a collective form of intellectual property owned by all producers within that region. And it has allowed, in that context, a greater share of value to be captured by the producers themselves. Now, this form of intellectual property was then recognised and promoted globally through the TRIPS agreement of the WTO, where it became known under the more generic identifier of geographical indications. Now, I wanted to contrast this briefly with another form of intellectual property and another case that you may be aware of. In 2005, the Ethiopian government registered trademarks for some of their well-known coffee origins, Sidamo, Hurrah, and Yirgacheffe. Now, these weren't geographical indications, they were trademarks. The logic being that the geographical indications were too complicated. They required a complex system of traceability back to farm and assurances that the geography and the place names were somehow linked to quality. Now, many roasters in the sector at the time objected to these registration of trademarks and suggested instead that geographical indications were a more appropriate form of IP. Now, since then, I think due largely to the changes in the Ethiopian coffee sector, this issue of the trademarks has somehow slipped from our view. But yet, I think it's likely it hasn't gone away altogether, and I think the ramifications of that case are still being played out across the coffee world. Now, these images are not from Ethiopia, they're from the highlands of Sulawesi in eastern Indonesia. And yet the same arguments used by the Ethiopians, the coffee was grown in small batches, in scattered hamlets, in difficult terrain with poor infrastructure that made traceability difficult, if not impossible, can also be used in the cases of eastern Indonesia. Now, most of my research, as mentioned earlier, is in Indonesia, where I'm funded largely by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, and I work together with the Indonesian Coffee and Cocoa Research Institute. Now, as it turns out, in Indonesia, they've gone more for the form of intellectual property akin to geographical indications. And coffee was very much at the fore of this form of IP. It was the first product to be registered as a geographical indication in the country, the Kintamani barley coffee, and it continues to be the single most popular product registered under the system. Of course, Indonesia is not alone in using geographical indications. There's similar systems of IP established in Kenya, Jamaica, Colombia, and elsewhere. Now, Indonesia is a diverse country, made up of many hundreds of different ethnic groups, from the Far East in the spectacular Balium Valley of Papua, through to the far west and Sumatran island we might be more familiar with, such as the Smendo region here, which grows largely Robusta coffee. Now, across these varied regions and physical geographies, regional cultural identities are very much linked up with the product that's being produced. And so GIs are seen partly as a way of actually promoting and protecting cultural diversity linked up to products as much as it is about value capture. And as you can see, GIs have become increasingly popular over the last decade, with the number of products registered increasing each year. Now, despite this strong interest within Indonesia for the registration of GIs, as of now, there's been very little research that's being done to actually assess what sort of impacts the GIs are having on producer livelihoods. Are they leading to any increased improvements in livelihoods? And this is the question that my research team is attempting to address. Essentially, are there tangible benefits to producers as a result of these GIs? And furthermore, whether GIs are in fact the most appropriate form of IP to improve livelihoods. Now, it turns out that methodologically this is a complex thing to assess. It's complex, one, if we want to compare, for example, prices paid to farmers living within a GI area to those living outside the GI area. It's like comparing apples to oranges, because of course, by definition, the GI region should be distinct and the product produced in it should be different to that produced elsewhere. Second of all, coffee prices, of course, are fluctuating all the time. So if there's been a change over time, it's difficult to determine whether that change has been due to the project intervention, GIs in this case, or due to other factors. In fact, if we really wanted to demonstrate the benefits of a program that we've invested in, the ideal time to commence the project would have been in 2005, when coffee prices were less than $1 per pound, and then to come back in 2011 when they were more than $2. And in fact, I have seen a number of reports that have done just that, including reports assessing the impact of GIs and indeed the Ethiopian trademark case to demonstrate the benefits to farmers. Of course, we should be very cautious about accepting such results in this context of changing global prices. Now, instead, our research study used a theory of change model, where we sat down with the various organisations responsible for establishing GIs in Indonesia, and we established a model of different processes required that were anticipated to be required for the GI to have an impact. And we then selected a number of indicators for each of these stages and went through and assessed whether they were in fact occurring. Now, we didn't, for the case studies for the research, we didn't look at the more well-known origins such as the Sumatran Arabicas, Sulawesi coffee or Java coffee. Instead, we did work in the Kintamani region in Bali because that was the first GI established in the country, and it was established with a lot of support from the government and indeed from international organisations at the time. And the second case study we looked at was the Bajawa district in Flores, which was identified by members of the National GI Board as being the most effectively functioning GI in the country. We figured that if any case studies were likely to demonstrate impacts of farmers, it would be these two origins. So part of the research involved a random survey of farmers who were formally registered as being part of the GI, and the first stage there was to assess whether the farmers themselves were involved in the process of establishing the GI. Now, first of all, it was surprising that less than half of all the farmers formally registered were actually aware that a GI had been registered in their district. Even fewer had a reasonable understanding of the GI concept itself, and fewer again had received any training from the NPIG, the community organisation that was tasked with managing and regulating the GI. So it seemed that, in fact, the GI was fairly poorly embedded within the community. The NPIG is also, according to the protocols of the GI, required to undertake quality monitoring at least 3 stages. It's supposed to be quality monitoring on farm, and then at local processing units, and then of lots prior to trade. Now, this photo was actually taken back soon after the GI had been established in Kintamani, when the NPIG was provided with significant funding to establish a cupping lab. Now, going back last year, neither of the GI case studies we looked at were actually implementing any form of quality management and monitoring on a routine basis. So that next stage in the process was not being met. We then looked at the other end of the chain and to see whether the GI labels themselves were recognised in the marketplace. And we did this through an internet analysis of different companies who were offering coffees from either Flores or barley that were available in either the Indonesian or the English language. This shows that there was about 50 offerings from each of the two origins. Now, the light grey area here shows that some coffees were offered using a more generic label of barley, and then this mottled area shows that a large number were actually using the Kintamani name for their sales. Now, only one coffee from the more than 50 that we found were using the GI label as required and set out in the book of specifications of the GI, and that was a coffee being sold in the Indonesian market by an Indonesian roaster. So it seems here that while the place names themselves did have some sort of market value, the GI label didn't. We then thought, okay, well maybe at the retail level there's no value in the GI label. Perhaps at other stages of the value chain the label is being used as some sort of signifier of quality. So we spoke with various green bean traders and roasters who essentially confirmed that none of the ones that we spoke to were using the label as a way of assessing coffee quality. Instead, they would rely on other time-tested forms of assessing quality, such as cup testing and the like. So despite the high interest in GIs from within Indonesia, and indeed from some roasters in the broader community, the GIs were not having any sort of tangible impact on the livelihoods of farmers based on our theory of change. At the end of the day, roasters and consumers didn't really care about the GI label. Now, this, however, was a conclusion we weren't all that satisfied with. It still didn't answer why there was such strong interest, particularly from within Indonesia, towards the GIs. And I should say, as I mentioned before, the research was done in partnership with the Indonesian Coffee and Cocoa Research Institute. And my partners there were adamant that, even though there were no tangible benefits at this stage, there were numerous intangible benefits, and that in the longer term would be a benefit to the producers themselves. So I wanted to now articulate what their argument was for the benefit of GIs. And they would often use or refer to the case study of the Toraja region of Sulawesi to make their case. So Toraja is a place, an ethnic group and a culture in Sulawesi. They've been growing coffee in the highlands there for at least 150 years. And then in the 1970s, a Japanese-owned coffee company established a plantation and a processing unit and a factory in the highlands. This just shows a typical landscape within a Torajan village, and I want to sort of highlight the architectural forms that are found within Toraja. And these sorts of villages are widespread across the whole Toraja region. So the company I referred to there, established in the 1970s, set up very, very intimate relationships with farmers, whereby they would often go along very poor roads to remote communities and buy very small batches of coffee, sometimes 10, 15 kilograms, label it as belonging to particular farmers, and then back at the processing mill, cup individual samples and pay farmers according to the cup characteristics. So through this system, over a number of decades, the quality within the material quality of the coffee in the region had improved dramatically. And indeed, the company was also responsible for making the name Toraja well known in the marketplace. And so they established a trademark, Tuarko Toraja. And as you can see, they also borrowed from the cultural imagery of the traditional architecture from the Toraja region. And indeed, other roasters as well will borrow quite freely from the pictographs that are found on the housing and use that in barrels to sell their coffee. Now, this is a complex issue. I want to highlight that on the one hand, the company was instrumental in creating both material quality and indeed promoting the regional name of Toraja. Yet many Indonesians felt some sort of moral violation, that their cultural property was being used and by others for profit. In this sense, it was seen as something of a violation of the sovereignty of Indonesia. Now, sovereignty is a sensitive issue in Indonesia. You're talking about here a middle-income country and indeed the world's fourth most populous country. And this idea of a violation has strong historical roots in the colonial history of Indonesia. On the island of Java alone, for a full 200 years, coffee was grown under the notorious forced cultivation system, where profits from the industry were systematically siphoned off and transferred back to the colonial headquarters in the Netherlands. As such, the current appropriation of cultural property is seen to be continuing these same sorts of wrongdoings that occurred in the colonial past. Now, some of you might be familiar with the Max Havelaar Foundation. It's a fair trade foundation in the Netherlands. Max Havelaar was actually a 19th century novel written under the pseudonym Multatuli that highlighted in graphic form the series system of exploitation underneath the forced cultivation system. Now, my aim here is not to give you a history lesson on coffee in the Dutch East Indies, but it's to highlight the way that current appropriation of value can be viewed when seen through a neo-colonial lens, which is the way many Indonesians see it. Now, whilst we're all familiar with the various labels, sustainability and other ethical labels that are found within the industry, the GI marks or the labels can maybe somehow get lost in the crowd. But for many Indonesians, the GI label is very distinct from these other sustainability-based labels. It's a series of standards that were authored by the producing community, that's monitored by the producing community, and is then allocated out for use by the community itself, rather than being externally authored. And this, for many in Indonesia, is a key distinction. Now, many of us involved in the specialty coffee sector would like to see stronger relationships with producer communities. However, such genuine relationships appear to be somewhat elusive. Now, as a technocratic intervention largely imported from Europe, GIs have been unable to deliver tangible benefits to farmers. However, on talking with more and more people within the Indonesian sector, it's quite clear that GIs aren't simply a technocratic intervention, but they're seen as a moral claim over cultural property, more akin, if you like, to the trademark system in Ethiopia. Now, for many years, many of us involved in the coffee sector have told intimate stories about producers, producer families, taken photographs of farmers, used them for marketing purposes, sometimes with the permission of those we're taking photos of, sometimes without, and sometimes not even knowing their names. So it seems to me that whilst such practices are increasingly being brought into question by those in the coffee industry, I can foresee a time when the use of geographical names may be brought under similar moral pressure. It may well be that producers and indeed consumers may demand that any use of a geographical place name by a roaster is accompanied by some sort of recognition of systems of IP, whether it's GIs or other. I guess if we are to see that in the next 5-10 years, the next question becomes whether such forms of recognition of IP will actually result in improved livelihoods for the farmers involved. Thank you.